All right. Good morning, everyone. So let me just go over what we want to do today. So we have 10 open issues. We still want to review the backlog because we have a lot of stuff in there. It seems we're still hovering over 33 for some reason because everybody files new issues, it seems. So we will do a few more out-of-band API reviews. Normally we do Tuesday, but I guess we will do a few more Thursdays and Fridays to get the stuff under control. So I think this one, is you, Tarek, right?
Yeah, I can talk about it. For this one, we have the activity class, which is used for tracing. And this class have a property called tags, which is return a collection of tags, which is key value pairs. And this, when you get this collection, I mean, like, you can enumerate, you can do whatever you want with it. But the activity class itself doesn't have any ways that you can get a specific tag from this collection without returning the whole collection. So every time you call activity.tags, it returns the whole collection, which is allocate a new collection for you before returning it. So users, to access specific or to get a specific tag from this list, they have to get the collection first and then enumerate and get this item. So the proposal here is just to add a method in the activity tag, which is, we call it get tag item, which is takes the key of the tag and it returns the value of this tag from this collection without allocating anything. Why we use this name get tag item? Because we have a similar concept inside the same class activity. We have something called the baggage, and baggage, actually, we have a property called baggage, which is return also a collection. And to access or to get a specific item from this collection, we have another method called get baggage item. So we choose just to use this name get tag item to match the other one, which is get baggage item. So that's all.
Yeah, so I'm thinking. I'm just looking over what other APIs we have on this thing today. So yeah, so it seems you already have the pattern that basically a bunch of methods that are directly on activity like get and add already.
Right.
So that seems kind of within that thing.
Yes.
The only thing is like, it seems actually maybe I'm looking at the wrong API signature here. No, never mind. Okay, so get baggage item is also returning a nullable string. So it looked right now it was returning a non-nullable string, but that's not the case. So, okay, so that seems fairly straightforward.
So just to make sure I understand, this is an issue because the baggage property returns an enumerable rather than a collection. Like if it returned a collection, this wouldn't be an issue, right?
Yeah, it returned enumerable, yes.
Yeah. And both have the semantics that they can only have a single value?
Yeah. It's the collection itself or the enumerable is just key value pair.
Right,
so,
but like I thought it's possible that you have like the same key can be used multiple times, no?
It's possible, but we always return the first one in the list. It's the same for the baggage. It's not new concept.
Right, but like what's the semantic when you have multiple keys? Is it basically when you submit the payload, we also only ever store the first one, or is it actually meaningful to have that?
It's
just a list. It's not a dictionary.
Yeah, it's not intended actually to have like multiple keys with same value, but this was the design from first day, which is we are living with. This is why we added some other methods in .NET 5 that like it's called like set tag, which is ensures that you can just have either updated the same key that exists in the list or add this key if the key is not in the list.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that from add and set. I was just wondering if we only expose this API, basically only ever return the first. So I'm just wondering
Yes.
whether we eventually have, 4 more methods for like, get nth, right? Or something like that, where you can say, yeah, that key and then, the index, the first one, second one, or third one, right? But if that's not very likely, then that seems
No,
fine.
this is unlikely. And we are not encouraging people to add multiple values with the same key in the first place. So,
Yeah, and looking at the get baggage item implementation,
yeah.
it's just for eaching the property that's returning the IEnumerable anyway. So there's no perf benefit. This is just a convenience call, right? I mean,
No.
it could be restructured later to avoid if there's a on-the-fly IEnumerable being generated, it could avoid it. But this is really just about cleaner syntax than saying items.first where kvp.key is whatever.
Actually, internally, we have that we maintaining the list inside internal like linked list, and when you request the package or the tags, we actually enumerate and create a new enumerable for it. So we allocate object every time you call tags or package.
Right, but the implementation of get baggage item just calls that property, which
Yeah.
so it's right now it is get baggage item at least is just a convenience method. It's just syntactic sugar. There's no perf advantage. There's no.
Yeah, I internally we can optimize this, but I'm not talking about the tags itself. I mean, we are not going to do the same. I mean, we just like.
Right. So I'm just saying the reason that people want this method is just because the call to get the value back is currently ugly looking, and they just want a cleaner thing. There's no perf isn't a goal or uniqueness isn't a goal.
No, actually, part of it is the perf. I mean, yeah, I mean, convenient is one thing, but perf also. I mean, some people also didn't like about like getting the whole collection just to get one item from it. Yeah, I mean it's both.
Yeah, does anybody have opinions? I think the alternative design, you said maybe we should just have try get instead. Like, I mean, it seems to me if the type is not a generic, if the type is always a reference type, and it's kind of logical to assume that null doesn't make sense, I think the get syntax works fine. And if you actually have the query syntax, not the query syntax, the expression, what's it called, the pattern kind of syntax where you say, if activity dot try get, key comma out var value, like it's very similar to if activity get tag item foo is string s, right? So you can even write the code the same way or almost the same way, right? You don't even have to have multiple lines. So I think they are both as short. I mean, I personally find the get one a little bit more intuitive than the try get one, but I don't have super strong opinions.
I agree with that because, like, I mean, if you have try for this, I mean, it will not be consistent with the package APIs. I mean, so.
Yeah. I already should be, right? Yeah.
The baggage and the tag both do seem to support null values to go with their keys. So
that's right.
There is technically ambiguity with it returning null, but no one complained with baggage. So
yes.
I think it's fine to just match what it's already done.
I see. So we do accept null values. What does it actually mean? Yeah, I guess.
If I recall correctly, the answer with telemetry is whatever the provider feels like doing.
So I guess the answer then is like, the get one is basically the 90 percentile, and then if you want more, you just for each over the collection, and then you can get, multiple keys, and you can also find out whether they're actually null or whether they're truly non-existent, right?
Yeah.
Seems reasonable. So unless somebody has objections, I would just approve it as proposed. I don't hear anything, so that means one down. All right, so I think this one is Miriam. I'm not sure Miriam is on the call. I don't think she is. Can anybody else?
I can speak to it though.
Okay, cool. Then let's do it.
So, the hosting model, but we have background services in the generic host, and kind of there's been a lot of complaints about the way we handle exceptions that happen in the background service. Today, well, before 6.0, when an exception would happen, it would just kill the background service. Nothing would get logged, and the app would continue on running. And so, at the beginning of 6.0, we added it so at least if an exception happened in the background service, we log it. And now the ask is to be able to like fail the app basically when a background service crashes or throws an exception. The proposal is to add there's an existing class, this host options. The proposal is to add a Boolean to control this behavior. It would be off, be false by default to continue the current behavior. And so somebody, when they create the host, they can set this to true, so it would crash the app. My biggest concern with this is that I kind of feel like it should be an enum, because I imagine other options we would want in the future, as opposed to just a Boolean about basically crashing on background service exception.
And so to be clear, like these host options are the initial thing that you create, right? So it's basically in the program class where you basically boot up the create default builder and then configure web host defaults, blah blah blah. That's where you would pass in the options, right?
Correct. Yep. That's where you when you create the host builder, you can pass in options there. And so this would just be a new property on the existing host options.
And to be clear, the behavior, there wouldn't be any behavior changes, right? The idea is that people would have to modify that code to set this thing to true, correct?
That's my initial thoughts on how I would want to do it. I mean, there is some questions about the default changing to stopping on background exceptions to be more consistent with other programming models like console apps and WPF, etc.
Right. Yeah, I guess my question is, what do we think is, I mean, ignoring compat for a second, like, do we think that the old behavior is a better default, or do we think the new behavior would be a better default? Because it seems like, as you said, like it's always bad when things crash and you don't figure, like you don't see anything, right? And then just that.
Yeah, I mean, you get it today now. Like we did fix it, so you get the error logged at least, right? It was horrible before because there was no indication.
So the
I don't know.
Console log would at least tell you that something bad happened, right?
Right. I mean, there's reasons for both ways, right? Like ASP.NET, when they originally did this, the thinking was you're going to have multiple background services, and just because one failed doesn't necessarily mean you want the whole service taken down.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I think my only concern with this proposal is that I don't know how discoverable the host options are today. Like, I would think that most people probably wouldn't figure out how to do that. So if the default is still what we ship today, then I think very few people will be actually able to take advantage of this. But I also don't have a magical solution to this unless we're willing to say, yep, it's a breaking change, we document it, and then it's like, if you want to get the old behavior back, yeah, you have to do some work, but almost everybody gets the new behavior for free, right? That seems also not, I don't know, like it seems hard for me that you want this behavior, like because your app is probably not working well when half of your services stop working, right?
If this is the case, so do we need this property at all? I mean, if we change the default and we can provide like config switch or something, if somebody wants his old behavior.
I mean, that's the thing, right? If we believe we make the new behavior the default and it just boils down to, people have to be able to get the old behavior back, then if we think it's super advanced and almost nobody needs that, then I think a compat switch may be the better way to do it. But yeah, if we think that this is useful, I just don't think it's very discoverable. That's my only concern with this proposal here. But I also don't know what else to do, quite frankly, because I don't think it's a matter of like just put the property somewhere else, because it's not. I think it's just not very discoverable.
I mean, quite honestly, it depends on who you are and what opinions you have, right? Like the very first people who are using hosting, this is kind of a pitfall, right? Like,
right.
Especially before, when there was no logged exception, it would just go off, but there has been a decent amount of complaints about the exception handling, to the point where people kind of made their own little layer of like critical background services where they're guaranteed certain behaviors.
So if we change the default, I mean, how people will be broken? I mean, what? Yeah, I mean, like, what is the symptoms would be, or what problems you will run into?
So if we changed it, if you currently had a service that, your whole service was running, say, 10 background services, and one of them failed before, your app would continue on, right? And now when you upgrade, and you think that's fine behavior, right? Like, you were happy with that behavior. Now when you upgrade, you run your service, that background service fails, and now your app crashes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
This would be very bad, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I can see it not making, if people were relying on that behavior.
I mean, to me, it's kind of like I'm honestly not super sure either way. Like, I can see arguments for both ways. I mean, I just have a hard time thinking that somebody wants that behavior. I can see somebody inadvertently relying on that behavior, but I don't think that just silently continue when one of my services crash as desirable behavior.
Yeah, we don't silently anymore, right? But it's continued.
Sure, but
right?
I mean, if your app is running, you're not necessarily actively looking at the log, right? If you're debugging in Visual Studio, sure, but if your app is actually deployed in production, then.
I mean, one stupid analogy, right, is like your Windows machine has services running, right? Would you want your Windows machine to shut down just because one of those services failed?
Well, I mean, that might be a bit of a drastic comparison, but yeah, I mean, that's.
But I mean, depending on what you're doing in your app, right? Like, if you're really running multiple background services in your app,
right,
you potentially don't want that whole thing to go down just because of one. So.
Yeah, the reason I'm saying that is like, because I mean, they all run in proc, right? So like, you're sharing data structures most likely, right? So if one of your services crashed, right? Like, it seems, I don't know, like, you would have to do some interesting work to make that recoverable, right? Like, presumably that service did something useful, right? So the question is, if that service no longer does anything, is your app actually working, or is your app just running, right? So that's why I'm saying, like, to me, it seems hard to picture a way where somebody wants that. I can just see a case where, well, the app is actually buggy, the app actually doesn't work, but it works enough that people are not broken by this behavior, right? But that's why I'm saying it seems to me it's on the fence of, like, I can see an argument either way, but
the main argument for me for changing the default is for new developers coming to use the hosting service. This seems like a common pitfall,
right?
That they don't expect, that they expect if your background service fails, that like it to act like other .NET apps, right? For your app to go down. There's an unhandled exception, your app goes down.
I mean, so strictly speaking, if that's what we want, we can do that too, right? In that case, we would just say
that
the template basically. Yeah, well, I mean, you would have to change the template to set this thing to true, right?
Oh, I see.
Right, that's basically the way you would do it, and then you would say, yeah, we do file new project, and then you get that behavior. You will just, I mean, there will be another discussion now, because if we go down that path, it just means the templates will grow, which people also don't like, right? But maybe that's the first step, and then we can in .NET 7, decide that, oh, maybe we should just make it the default, right? So we can also say like, oh, let's ship this as an opt-in for now, and then later on we make it an opt-out if we believe that that is a better design.
Right. Progressively breaking change, if you will.
Yeah. Well, it wouldn't be breaking this release, right? Because existing code behaves exactly the same way, and if you do file a new project, well, the behavior is observably different, but I don't think we consider that a breaking change. It's just,
Right.
well, the project file that you created has different defaults. I mean, I'm okay with that. I would just say, like, if you expect people to discover this API, I would say my hope for that is close to 0.
Yeah, and that's why, like, new people aren't just going to discover it, right? And so that's
Yep.
why it feels like brand new people getting the behavior like the rest of the .NET feels more correct. Feels more what most people would want.
Yeah, it seems, generally speaking to me, when part of your process crashes, you probably want to have the semantics of the process is dying, rather than just continuing and praying.
Right. I mean,
would we
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
would we consider true as a default in .NET 6, or is that just way too breaking?
That's what we're talking about.
Right.
Okay, sorry. Okay, sorry about that. I didn't mean to just restate what people had said.
No,
But
that's
is that
okay.
like out of the question? Is that too breaking, or is it not? I'm just trying to get a feel.
I mean, my personal opinion is that I can see how it breaks people, because you may have an app that works today, but works with an asterisk where one of your background services crashes, but you either stopped actually using that thing, you're just not aware that it's actually still a part of your application, or your app, like the background service, doesn't do anything vitally important, and so it's okay if this thing doesn't do anything anymore. But I think at a high level, I have a hard time seeing somebody building something from scratch and wanting that behavior where if one of the services crashes, the app keeps running, right? So in that sense, I think a better default would be true. It's just a function of like how many people are impacted by this, and that
Right.
one
I mean-
I don't have a good handle on.
I think that the people that it would legitimately break is someone who has basically a watchdog or some sort of periodic timer that runs on their background thread. Maybe they weren't even looking for it crashing. They're just looking for it, being in a hang condition, and then they want to do a graceful shutdown of their main process. And now if the background thread throws an exception, instead of their graceful shutdown kicking in, it's just going to terminate the process. That's the risk of who you're breaking. They detected it and they dealt with it instead of they just went into a useless. Main hasn't exited, but the program's not doing anything.
So in the chat on Teams, I posted a link to Andrew Nurstanton's comment on why this behavior was made the way it was. I mean, it doesn't say much more than what we said, but it says a background service throwing an error during execute async doesn't cause the app to shut down. That's intentional behavior. If you want the other behavior, you'll have to try catch and use application lifetime to shut down your process.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I was in that triage. I don't think we were ever happy with the behavior, and we were just trying to give people workarounds. At least as we discussed in triage. Yeah, if there's no guiding principle that says that a change like this is never acceptable, I would personally push for making this the default to crash the process.
Is it better, to have the service notify the application that something wrong happened and let the application handle it instead of taking the decision on the behalf of the application?
I personally don't think so. I think it's surprising. I mean, I understand not wanting to break existing apps if we think it's common for execute async to throw.
I don't think it's common, but let's say it's 10%. I think that's probably still too many, right? So the question is, and that's, I don't think most will rely on this, but the question is still how many happen to rely on this and whether we are okay with that. Because here's the other thing, right? So keep in mind when the new behavior kicks in, people wouldn't necessarily know how to fix it, right? It's not obvious that because you changed their behavior, now you have to send, this property. Well, I guess we could make it actionable, right? Because we decide how the process dies, right? We can write a message to the console and say, hey, your background service just died, so we decided to shut down the process. If you don't like this behavior, go to this AKMS and figure out what you can do instead, right? So maybe that's okay, but I think if it happens in production, probably people will have to go through the logs to figure out what's happening, and that might piss people off, right? That's why I'm saying I might be okay with saying let's for now just make this opt-in, right? By either giving people an API, and then for .NET 7 decide, based on feedback that that's the new default, and we make a breaking change.
And change the template in 6.
Yeah, I guess that would be a good idea. Change the template in 6, make it opt-in, make the templates opt-in by default, and then, in 7 we can decide, screw it, we just make it the default.
I think that sounds like a reasonable plan.
I'm okay with it. It's possible some PMs see the template and are like, hey, let's just change the default. But we can have that discussion with the wider group.
Oh, totally. I mean, that's why I said earlier, like the problem with growing the template is then eventually you have more and more junk in the templates, right? But I feel like that to me might not be the worst of the world, because in that sense, our templates become effectively a running total of like, here's new behavior, right? And then you have to decide whether you move it out of the template and make it the platform default, or whether you leave it in the template, right?
Yeah, I feel like somebody had asked, does it make sense to handle that? So I'll ask it, or to expose a handler. Would it make sense for this to be basically like the app domain unhandled exception event, that we want a host option of what do you want me to do given this exception, and so that somebody could decide to handle different exceptions differently? So not a Boolean, but a handler, and then the handler they could call environment.failfast.
It's an interesting idea. I don't think a customer has asked for that. I wouldn't necessarily do that. Like, the question is, like, do you want a handler for like every background service, or do you look at each thing individually? I don't know.
I mean, if it really comes down to just like log it and let the thing be dead, or log it and terminate the process, then sure, the Boolean makes sense. But if it seems like anyone would want to do anything else, then maybe the handler is better than the Boolean. Is my only question. We could even have a static that matches the delegate of just shut down the process, and you would just register that as your handler. But if I think the Boolean is sufficient, it's fine. I'm just asking the questions.
I think the Boolean's enough personally, but I don't feel like super strongly about that.
My only concern with the Boolean is if we do want to have more options in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this one doesn't feel like the only thing I could ever want to do. And that's kind of to Jeremy's point a little bit too, about giving an extensibility to be able to do something else.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure an enum is necessarily better, because it still seems you have now a centralized place where you have to handle every possible app model in the world. So if we make it an actual event where you can write code, then we could again change the template to emit the code that basically just does environment fail fast. And then in other app models where you want to do something more sensible, like, I don't know, on a mobile device you may want to call some operating system API to suspend your app, or I don't know what the semantics are for that. And that might be better, but like, it's certainly more ceremony now to get the behavior right.
I have a question. For host options, is it also possible to set it in configuration? So if that's the case, if it's a Boolean, then it's easily configurable. But if it's a handler, then it only needs to be writing code for it. Is that
That one I don't know enough about. I mean, I would assume no matter what you do, you would have to write code somewhere. So I guess you could still say in config there is a you could say like, oh, in config you can say x equals true, and then when you read config, you apply some default handler or something. But
so my understanding on this is that it's the host that's loading the configuration, so it's a little too early. Right now, I think the only other host option is shutdown timeout. That can be configured via an environment variable.
So you're saying the
Let me
host,
double
because
check
it
that.
initializes everything, doesn't have access to the configuration APIs yet?
It might be fine as long as it's using it late enough. I'm sorry, but there are some host options that happen before configuration, that are used before configuration is loaded.
Right.
But I guess that probably wouldn't be this.
Makes sense. Yeah, also, I don't know, but the configuration helps us here because it's just, you still need an API, right? So then maybe there is configuration on top, or maybe there isn't, but I guess the only question is, like, is it a type that we can conveniently set from configuration? I assume enums would work already, and so enums or boots will be easier versus delegate or an event wouldn't be as great to set from config. But maybe I'm also over-engineering now. Like, I mean, it's just that for almost all these things where policy involved, you eventually want an event or a handler where you can actually write code. But maybe we can just kick the can down the road and say, like, we do it when we actually have evidence if someone needs it.
Yeah, and I do think that when I said event, I probably meant just a single action and not an actual event, because I don't know what multicast would mean, especially if we think that someone's going to write environment.failfast.
Yeah, I mean, like, practically speaking, they're both multicast, right? You can't really prevent that. But, like,
You have to do a whole lot more work to, like, assignment versus addition is a different pattern.
Sure.
But
yeah, so it seems to me like, okay, so Eric, what other options did you have in mind for this?
I mean, I think we'd only have 2 to start.
What would we call the enum?
Background service exception behavior. I don't know.
Yeah, I need to look at the namespace. What else is in there? So this applies to all hosts, right? The host options, they're not just for the generic one, right?
I don't know what you mean. Like there's the web host that doesn't respect this.
Yeah, so I guess that's my question. So does the web host derive from, like, web host options? Is there web host options that derive from host options, or are they separate options?
There's a
Or they have web host builder options, right? Which doesn't seem to derive from it. So I guess what I'm asking is, like, if we put this on this type, like, does it actually go in all the right places, or do we have to put this on more types?
This should go to all the right places.
Okay, then. That's a mouthful though. Background service exception behavior. And then the values would be what?
I think we would start with continue on exception and stop on exception, or exit on exception.
I think I would call it terminate process, because it's not stopping the service object, it's stopping the process.
I'd be fine with calling it terminate.
So terminate process, and then the other one is what? Continue?
Right.
And then continue would be the default, so it would be the 0 value, and then terminate would be 1.
Yeah, but if our plan was for terminate to become the default someday.
Yeah, continue is a weird word because it sort of feels like VB's on error resume next, and what it's really doing is it's terminating the background service, but not the process.
Right.
So really, they're terminate service and terminate process.
Right. Are we sure we want to terminate the entire? Oh, I see. Okay, my bad. So it'll be 3 possibilities. We're gonna have. Oh, sorry. So one is just let the service exit, the background service, and do nothing, basically, which is the behavior today in .NET 5. The other is environment.failfast. Do we want one where the host just exits? Like, it's kind of like normal shutdown. I thought that's what we were talking about to begin with. I didn't realize. So the workaround was environment.failfast, more or less.
Yeah, because I don't know what it means that with the current Boolean proposal if it's true. I don't know what dies.
Right. I thought we were doing more of an application lifetime stop application thing originally, where it just tries to shut down the host.
Right. I mean, like I think terminate process to me would imply we actually call failfast. If you just exit the host and then, subsequent code can run, I think we should have a different name for this. I mean,
so that'd be what? Terminate service, terminate host, and terminate process are 3 options.
Yeah, and I don't know whether we even want failfast.
Don't we want to have a graceful?
Yeah, I don't know that we do.
Don't we want to have a graceful shutdown when we opt into stop the application? In that case, fail fast, would that be what we want to do?
Yeah, I guess
I think not.
I think a fail fast to me only makes sense if you actually have the ability to get a dump. If you don't care about that, and it seems to me like just exiting the host or whatever the technologies that we're using for just basically, getting out of the run loop, that's probably is a more sensible default. Which in practice probably means just up shutdown, right? Because there's no other code that runs after that.
Right. I mean, my expectation, without knowing what any of this is actually doing, was that it's basically, instead of treating it like a background thread, which if it throws an exception is ignored, treat it like a foreground thread, which if it has an unhandled exception, your process is terminated. Like,
right.
No graceful handlers kick in unless you registered app domain, I'm about to die, and then you can be like, oh, cool, do something. Great, now it's too late, we're dead. But so that's where I thought terminate process was coming in. If this is terminating some host object, then that would be a different set of words.
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't know, like what we call this exit host or stop exit host, return from host. Like, I mean, they all seem to be, I don't know what's the actual entry point into the host called? Is it called run, or what is the name?
It's start. So there's an application lifetime.
It seems like it's in the generic host. It seems to be it's create host builder, build, and then on the builder you call run.
Right, and run calls start because there's also start and stop. And like on the lifetime objects, there's application started, application stopped, application stopping, and then a method called stop application.
And where is the stop?
So I would replace terminate process with
stop host or stop
on iHost application lifetime. There's a stop application method. I think that's what Steven's saying to call.
I see. Is that user visible code?
Yeah. It's a public interface.
Yeah, that was.
So iHost Builder has build and run, I believe. Actually, no. iHost Builder has build, and then I think iHost has. Is that the one that has run?
It has
And then
only
Runs
has start and stop async. I guess probably run is an
the
Runs
start,
extension
yeah,
method.
I host the
Runs an
service has start
extension.
and stop async.
Yeah.
Yeah, run async is an extension method, but it will do the whole thing.
Yeah. So I mean, in that case, it sounds like stop host would be the, the accurate description then what's happening when we say, just basically don't terminate the process, just finish the host, right, and then subsequent code can run.
Yeah, I think either like stop host or even stop application, since we already have like this whole application lifetimes thing, to use similar wording for the enum would be fine.
Yeah, I think stop application, because the method's name stop application. Like that's the method that you call if you want to kill it.
Yeah, I can agree with that.
Where do you call it on again?
iApplication lifetime, I think, is the interface.
Yeah, I host application lifetime. There is an application lifetime that is obsolete.
Correct, yeah.
I see.
Okay, is there a similar shutdown or terminate word that applies to just a background service?
I think it's stop service, right? Because I mean, services have basically start service, stop service.
Right.
I
I
guess
We
host
call
a
it
service
like
that start
ignore.
async.
I mean, the
But
trouble with
ignore
it,
is
ignore,
not-
Because it stopped. It's already stopped. It threw an exception.
ignore or continue both to me feel like there's a possibility that it, restarts whatever lambda or method or whatever it's supposed to have been doing. But it's not continuing. It's the host is continuing, the process is continuing, but the service is dead.
So maybe not continue. I think ignore is fine. I don't know why you would assume that the services get restarted. But if you want to put like not restart, I don't know.
Right, like ignore to me sounds like VB's on error resume next. There was a problem. I don't care. Move on.
So, I mean, let me ask a different question. So if I provide a hosted service, who's calling start async? I mean, I think that's the host doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if start async throws an exception, currently we don't call stops async, I suppose, right? We just, like, at that point, we just catch the exception and move on, right? Or are we actually saying, oh yeah, start through an exception, so no, let's call stops async and then...
It actually depends on how start throws. Like if start throws an exception immediately without awaiting, like
I see.
then the exception bubbles all the way up, right? But if start awaits and returns control back to the host, that's kind of the indication that it's like, hey, I started, right?
Do you actually mean that it's still on the same, I'll just say thread, and Steve will roll his eyes, or do you mean whether it's inside or outside the task?
I mean, literally if it returns control back to the host.
So like if it returns a task or just throws.
Right. Okay. Because
if the task that gets returned is faulted immediately as soon as the host gets it back. That's probably the most correct way to say it.
okay, so there is the task. The method came back with a task, and the task is already in a faulted state, as opposed to the method that you called that's supposed to return a task instead through an exception. Because async methods don't actually do what they say. They return an object that has a thing, and they could, like, if you don't write the word async, you can throw, and that throws on the call instead of in the task. There's a very important distinction of one of them is thrown to the caller and the other's only thrown to the caller if they call await or get result or any of the other things that would.
The host definitely doesn't await the start of a hosted service, because if it wanted to do another one, right? If this one's off running in the background and it wants to start another one.
Yeah, so I guess to me, ignore kind of is probably the least like the best word, as in because it doesn't imply a lot of policy. Because otherwise it gets very funky if you have to say, well, it depends on how the the actual service failed, right? And that becomes very nuanced then. If it's literally just, oh yeah, we basically stopped the service. I mean, maybe stop service is the better word then, but if it's like, well, sometimes we stop, sometimes we don't. I think ignore seems fine. I mean, to me, ignore doesn't imply the service gets restarted. It just means, yep, the service is dead and it's fine. Like, if there were a restart, I would assume they'd be explicitly called
The
a
one thing
restart.
it does do is it logs.
Yeah, I would probably not put that in the enum because that seems kind of like, well, maybe, but then, I don't know. Like, that seems to be almost orthogonal to the behavior.
Right. Like, I wouldn't say just because we're not ignoring it.
Well, yeah, I also
still
would
are.
call it log and ignore, right, or something, or log and continue. I would just call it, what you do actually.
Yeah.
Control flow wise.
Yeah, I mean, ignores okay. I'm merely raising that there is an interpretation, which is pretend the exception didn't happen.
Right.
Which would be like on error resume next. And if everybody believes that in 2021 that would be an absurd interpretation for someone to have, then cool.
Yeah. So then we basically
What's
only
wrong
have,
with continue?
The same problem of some people might feel that means that their code should continue as if the exception didn't or wasn't thrown.
I mean, the host does continue.
The background hosted service, the background service that through exception would probably not work. And so if we do continue, would it convey the message that the background service that through is going to continue working, which is an incorrect. So to I don't know if we renamed it to maybe continue without background service or something like that. I don't know. Continue without.
The enum itself, it's called background service exception behavior. So
Oh, right. Yeah.
Whatever name we need to choose, it should apply to that.
True.
I mean, one way to do it would be to say, like, to me, the difference between ignore and continue implies the service continues, which is not the case, right? Ignore doesn't really imply anything. It just means that, we eat the exception. And then you would have to think about what that means for the overall app, which I think seems probably the least controversial one.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
actually, the biggest one.
I feel like my proposal would be terminate service instead of continue, and stop application being the one that calls the stop application method.
That seems fine to me.
What about log and stop service? Log and stop.
Yeah, I mean, to me, log and stop kind of implies that first we will always log, which might not actually hold true, because to me, logging is kind of an orthogonal concern, so I wouldn't necessarily promise that as part of the enum. And then, like, stop kind of implies that you actually call stop service, which we don't, right? We just eat the exception. So I think
may have some graceful behaviors that you're not going to actually see happen.
I mean, to me, terminate service seems fine.
Yeah.
Faulting service seems fine. Exiting service seems fine. Like, any vocabulary that is not stop, basically, I think seems fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, just in my mind, it seems like the host is taking proactive action to stop the service in that case, like with any of those namings. Which in reality, it's just not doing things because when an exception is thrown. But I don't know.
I mean, I would probably...
Yeah, I mean, like, I feel not very strongly that it should describe the behavior that the author of the code experiences as opposed to what the code that is calling it is doing, where the ignore is, it was a background, something on a background thread through the thread's terminated and the process didn't care, like, we're done caring. Like, that's a detail of implementation, but what they experience is this thing that you registered as a background service is terminated.
But it's already has terminated. Like, the option is asking what the host should do after the process is, or after the background service is terminated.
Fair enough.
So to say that it will terminate or stop it, I mean, it's already terminated or stopped at that point.
I see that, and I guess really the problem is it depends on what the third thing is of whether or not whether the first one makes sense or not.
Would it make sense to restart the background service as like a third option, which doesn't exist yet?
I mean, that could be a future option if we wanted it to be.
So yeah, maybe ignore is the right answer.
I want to go back to stop application real quick.
Sure.
Because I think it should stop. It should be the behavior. I think should actually be to stop the host, and the stopping the host calls that stop application. And so I
mean, I think honestly, personally, I would prefer host because the whole thing that we talk about here is the host. It seems weird to bring in yet another concept.
Right. So stop host.
I'm fine with stop host.
Yeah.
That sounds good.
Okay.
Like honestly, it doesn't even matter like the order, right? Like even if you call even if the implementation where you stop application calls stop host, I think it's fine, right? Like it's logically really the thing you're talking about here is the host and the host ends, right? I think that's the number one thing we want to convey.
Right. Basically,
well, okay. There is that whole dance with application stopping that the run async extension method does, right? So there is like a subtle difference between stopping the application and the host. Generally, stopping the application induces the latter in run async.
Yeah, I mean, my question is,
I'm looking at
people care?
host.
Like, is that an important distinction? I mean, like, if you ever think that we may have different enum members for stopping the host and stopping the application, then sure. If you think it's just, well, that's just actually what happens, then that's more like a well, actually, and I don't think that's necessarily important to convey in the API.
Yeah, I think stop host is okay. It's just it basically requires that you're doing normal stuff like calling run async, which is fine.
And are we saying no zero value? Is that legal?
Well, it has a zero value, right? It's called ignore.
And it'd be okay that in the future stop host might be the default on options?
So. I mean, I mean,
okay.
I think the default value makes more sense when you consider default parameters and overloads and stuff. But like, I don't know, if you talk about settings, I think it's okay to say a default value is not the default memory, right? Like it could be a default string of something, right?
Yeah, I mean, if we wanted to be flexible while being transparent, we could introduce a zero value called system default.
Oh, that means...
What will it do? Whatever it wants to do. Would you like to have an opinion? Tell it what to do.
Would people be okay with shutdown host instead of stop host?
Works for me as well. To me, the theme
because like we have host.wait for shutdown async, and that's like the thing that would exit at that point. And then like host.run async would then call host.dispose because the host is shutting down. It's just like a little bit, I think it's a little bit more accurate.
My problem is the host doesn't have a shutdown method. It has stop method.
Right, but that's not being called. That's the thing. Like this, if we are doing something like calling application lifetime stop application, that doesn't directly stop the host, right? It's run async that's calling wait for shutdown async that effectively does that.
It's the other. I mean, host.stop will call application lifetime stop application, but then it does other things too, right? Like goes through all the hosts that are running and try stopping them.
I see.
Which I would assume that's what we would want. Like if you're, I think that's the most graceful way to do it, right? If you have 10 background thread or background services running and one of them faults and you want to stop, you're going to want to go stop the other ones right?
So generally, when we shut down the host, we use iApplication lifetime when it's running. The whole stop async is kind of what happens kind of after Control-C triggers, or a sig term or whatever triggers iApplication.stop application to run, and there's just the kind of entire unwinding. So to have something from like another thread call host.stop async, I don't know if we do that anywhere, or like from another continuation. You know what I mean? From like the outside of program main, I'm not sure we ever call like host.stop async directly.
Yeah, to me, it's a distinction about a difference because, I mean, like nobody actually calls any methods here, right? It's just you saying what behavior you want. And I think the key here is you want to stop the, shut down or exit the host, whatever. Any word that conveys that, I think is fine, I would argue.
Yeah, I agree it's minor. I'm fine with it as is. I was just asking.
So is then the API as it's on the screen right now? Are we okay with that? Are we okay with the bullets that I wrote above?
I think I'm okay.
Yeah, I'm not advocating for the system default, but did you want that, Eric?
The only reason I bring it up is because we are planning on changing it.
Yeah. The only reason I would really advocate for it at all would be so that someone, given that you're considering changing it, so that someone doesn't feel like they have a redundant line that they should erase where they're explicitly setting it to ignore. Which is, I understand you're planning on changing this behavior. I don't want you to do that. I don't think it's very likely. So if no one thinks it's likely, then this is fine as is.
Wait, sorry, what's not likely?
That someone would want ignore, or hope that they're keeping ignore past the upgrade. Maybe someone even writes the line that sets it to ignore, and then someone else later looks at the code and is like, but you're setting this to the value it already has by default. This is stupid, and then erases that assignment. And now they're back to, it depends on which version of the runtime they have.
I don't know, that seems far-fetched. I don't know, like my assumption usually is not that the 0 bytes are always the default. That seems like, I don't know. That's just not
right.
really
And so the question is, should ignore actually be that 0? Or should there be a 0 value, which is you didn't express a preference and we'll do whatever we think the right answer is?
That's interesting.
I mean,
basically it's the same as if we made the property be nullable. And so maybe the answer is make the property be nullable. You didn't have an opinion, we'll make something up.
Sure. I mean,
this is only because we're already talking about changing it.
Right.
Right. Like, I think if it weren't for backcompat issues, we would make this the default. The stopping the host. Because of this whole discoverability thing.
I'm okay with it as is, with a system default or with nullable, whatever area people think. I just ask questions.
Could we not make the break and then have a app context switch for users to opt back into the previous behavior if they need it? Or do we actually want it controllable on a per instance level?
Well, I think if we already knew that we will change the default, then I don't think I would do an API. But I think the problem here is that we don't know how many people are broken. And so we want this staged kind of thing where we say, well, we don't change the default for .NET 6. We just changed the template. So new apps, we use the new behavior. And then by .NET 7, we're going to decide whether we actually change the default, right? Like, I mean, I don't know. Like, I mean, this is also early in the cycle, right? So if we want to say, fuck it, we actually do make the behavior change, well, hopefully we have enough people using the preview bits, and if nobody yells at us, that's how we ship. Which honestly isn't that insane. I mean, if we were like, in June or July right now, I would probably not say we do that, but given that we are in January, it seems not outrageous to try that.
I say let's try it. If I get a vote.
I would say just change the default from now and provide a config switch with it. And we will see about like how many people is going to complain, and later we can decide to switch the default value for the config switch itself if we find like this is wrong.
My experience has been we don't get much usage on our previews.
I mean,
And it's typically like the end of like we
that's
ship an
fine.
RC1 and then a bunch of people actually use it. We've already trying to lock down RC2 by that time, and then we have a firefight at the end.
Yeah, we can service it if we need to after the.
yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with Eric. The only caveat I would say is like I think the one preview that gets decent amount of attention is whatever the build is, right? So because that's the one that we actually announce very heavily, and then the rest are just increments, right? So I think any change before build will probably get attention. Anything after build, yeah, you basically talk about a few thousand people, right? So that's why, given that we are relatively early, I think I can live with the, let's break and see what falls out. I think past build, I would probably go with you don't really know until you ship an RC, and then, then becomes a fire drill. I mean, it's not a horrible fire drill. I mean, I think we can decide, I guess, but I don't know. Like, to me, it kind of seems like we already have a design, so we would just have to get it out of the cabinet and then just implement it, right?
Yeah, I mean, like if we didn't change the default from now, I don't think we will be able to do it in the future. We will be in the same situation all the time. So you at some time you have to take the risk and do it and see. I mean, have a plan for if something goes wrong here.
I mean, I would say that the only downside with the conservative plan is more noise, right? You introduce an API, you change templates one way, then you change templates the other way. So that might be a bit over the top for something that maybe not many people actually are impacted by, right? But that is kind of predicated on that, right? If I don't know, 10% of apps are broken by this, then that's probably a bad plan, right? If it's less than 1%, then it's probably fine. And that one I just don't know. I mean, it's very hard to reason about error behavior and how people rely on this inadvertently, right? But yeah, I don't know. Like, to me, it seems like it's not an insane plan to say, screw it, we don't ship any API. The only thing we do right now is an app compat switch, and the new behavior is the new behavior.
I'd be okay with shipping a new API and changing the default, I think. Especially that gives us much more ability to we just change the default back if we get a bunch of reports that this is breaking them. Right? But the API is still there, and then you can pick which one you want.
And you think that's better than an app compat switch? Why?
Because those things are not, they're just even more hidden, right?
Yeah.
And we don't document them like we should because it's not really an API. And
well, I mean,
it's just a bunch of strings.
I mean, even if we have an API,
Right.
I think we would have to document a breaking change, right? And I think that's usually where we would document, or the context in which you would document the app compat switch. Like, to me, the only reason I'm saying, maybe we don't do an API is because I don't think the API is massively discoverable either. So it just seems fewer moving pieces, but yeah.
I mean,
I'm not
an
fighting
app
that either.
context switch is an API, right? It is an API. It's just a different way of doing an API. Still need to
Okay.
support it just as long as we do a normal API, right?
All right, so then let's do the following. Let's ship the API as proposed.
I don't know.
So
I
the
don't,
question,
I don't think we have a good history with that.
so I mean, the question would be like, do we normally give you options through APIs or through app context switches?
I think to me it kind of depends on what you think the future is, right? So to me, an app compat switch only makes sense if you believe it's a if we expect for most people it's a temporary clutch until they have it under control. If you think somebody will write a net new app and they want the old behavior for that app by design, an app compat switch I think is horrible. I think at that point you want to say, no, I have an intention here and I intend to use this behavior, and an API is just an idiomatic way of doing that. So to me, an app compat switch is only something that you apply as temporary duct tape.
I mean, since this was an intentional behavior to ship hosting like this initially, it doesn't feel like it might have been a mistake to be the only behavior, and it might have been a mistake to be the default behavior. It doesn't scream to me that it was a mistake to have that behavior at all.
That's fair.
I think you could maybe argue it's a mistake to have the behavior based on like how background services kind of grew up from hosted services, right? So you didn't have the execute async originally. So there's that like kind of mismatch. Like if you have like iHosted service. So it's like originally we just had iHosted service, if I recall correctly. And then we added background services that gave you this execute async. So now there suddenly could have exceptions after start async. But I think if we started with just background services, we would have had it. We might have had it differently. It's hard to know because, you know, things happen the way they did.
Okay, so I think I actually like the plan of shipping the API, I think, because it gives us the most flexibility. And even if we eventually think it's a mistake to offer that behavior, I still think it's not terrible because it's also not a very prominent API, so it doesn't really pollute people's experiences. So
yeah, for what it's worth, I'm fine with it being an option. I don't think it needs to be a app context switch.
And so that means to me, like, you know, if we actually get feedback from the previews that it breaks too many people, the only change you would have to do is change the default. Everything else would stay as is, right? And then maybe we additionally change the templates because we think new code should take the new behavior, but that seems optional at that point. But that's the fewest amount of moving items here. All right, so are we okay with that, or any more tweaks?
I'm fine with this plan.
Cool. Then let me do that. And then here we go. Here's Tanner with his 500 APIs.
So just continuation of this issue from last week, I added the full set of recommended functions that we're currently missing. The notable 4 that are missing from this list are the max number and max magnitude number APIs, which we previously reviewed and which got pushed back because there were concerns about confusing users with the additional names, but they are also technically part of this set.
So which ones are those?
That would be issue 29279.
No, I mean like the new ones that you think are confusing.
It's max number and max magnitude number. So the existing max and max magnitude functions that take double and float return nan if either of the inputs is nan. Max number and max magnitude number have a inverse behavior where they never return the nan unless both inputs are nan. And we previously reviewed it, and it got pushed back as putting max number next to max may confuse users.
Yes.
But it's part of the recommended set of APIs that we're missing.
I see.
The only alternative for those ones so far has been we could put them on float and double as static methods, but given the the requirements around syncing with the language and everything else on that, and if we're going to be adding this full set of APIs as well, I'm not sure that the confusion warrants postponing those. I think the IntelliSense and the fact that they only exist for double and float will allow users to know how they function and how to use them.
So I'm not entirely sure what you're proposing. I think it's what sounds like you're saying we should expose those APIs on Math and MathF.
Yes.
But they're not in the proposal here, right?
No, I left them out because we had previously reviewed and rejected them, and I didn't want to block this on that.
I see.
But if no one has a concern with it, then I think we should just approve them side by side.
I mean, it seems to me if the goal is to just be compliant with IEEE 754 2019, whatever the number is, then it seems weird to go 99%. At that point, I'd rather go the whole way. I think the confusion, I mean, because I don't know, like just exposing these APIs by themselves, I think I can defend that's confusing and seems of little value. If it's part of a larger set and that gives us the entire, compliance might be the wrong word here, but the entire consistency of that spec, that seems a bit more of a compelling argument at that point. But I mean, there certainly will be people that will be confused by this, but it's probably not worse than the 2 or 3 or 4 options that we have for rounding, right? Where you have to read this means this means that, and then there is some nuance, right? So as long as the first sentence for the what is it, max number is this API has different behavior due to nonce, and then the explanation follows, I think that's also probably not terrible, right?
Yep.
So like, what was the signature again? So this would be public static double.
I'm just going to post it in Teams chat here,
perfect.
But it's from issue 29279 if we just wanted to approve them separately.
Yeah, I just put them in here now so we can call this a day. Perfect. Oh, perfect. Here's the full signature set. I love it.
So the only thing that I'm confused about in this proposal is the 2-argument version of tan pi, especially because in your comment you don't use y or x. It just says special handling.
Right. So it computes atan2 just like regular and atan2, but there's some it's not directly expressible in basically normal C, and I didn't want to have to write out the 3 or 4 paragraphs explaining the difference there. Because atan2 is effectively atan y over x, the handling around pi isn't quite atan y times pi over x. It's slightly adjusted to account for divisions with where one of the inputs is infinity or negative infinity in a couple other cases.
Okay, but so I guess if it's like atan2, but different, then I guess that makes sense why it's y comma x when everything else is x comma y. But atan2 is named atan2, so should this be tan pi 2?
The name in the IEEE spec is atan2 pi.
I mean, that seems better to me because it's telling you it's a variant of atan2.
Mm-hmm.
And so if tan pi is actually atan pi, then I would call it atan pi instead of tan pi, especially because atan and tan are inverses, I think.
Yeah, atan and tan are inverse.
Yeah, so if tan pi is actually atan pi, we definitely want the A on it.
That's true for all 3 variants?
1 second, let me get the...
Actually, it seems like they're duplicated. You have...
Yeah, it looks like you have sine pi, cos pi, and tan pi, which are the forward ones, and then the A's, you forgot to put the A's in front of in the proposal.
Yeah, that seems like...
Yes, that would be the case. That's just a copy-paste error.
Okay.
And it's
capital
A and then lowercase t and s?
Yeah.
Yes.
And then in the 2-argument a tan pi, it should be a tan 2 pi.
Yes.
A10 pi. That's the one that takes 2 arguments, right?
I completely missed that. I messed that up.
See, it's Jeremy's
Added
really
value.
today.
I killed an hour on the previous one for no reason, and I added value in this one. Yay! I'm back to net neutral.
Wow, that's harsh.
I expected your comment to be, you think you're all the way back to neutral? But
I also just updated them in the original post to make that easier to correlate later.
So I also sort them alphabetically. I'm not sure that changes anything, but so
I mean, you didn't really, because the A's aren't up at the top, but
sure.
Yeah, and you
did that.
you missed fixing cos pi to cos pi and a cos pi.
Okay,
Yep.
so I see. Okay, so
nice try, Emo. Alphabetical ordering's hard.
it is, especially for an idiot like myself. Sort. I really wish
It sounded like sarcasm, but if you're doing it by hand, it is hard. I often forget the alphabet when doing it by hand.
No, I'm copying. No, the problem is I did use VS Code for that, but then I edited after I did it, right? So it's not helping my case.
Yeah. All right, so everything's xy except for a tan 2 pi, which matches yx of a tan 2. Yeah, that seems good to me.
All right, then approved.
Did you add the maxes in this one?
I did. Yeah, they're like, they're here. Max
Yep.
magnitude, max number, min magnitude, min number.
Yep.
All right, so then let's close this guy. Tanner.
All right, so we actually approved this API already. This was the one that I mentioned where there was a question on whether or not it should be an extension method, because the equivalent API we exposed for vector 128 and vector 256 is. So if you scroll all the way to the bottom, or sorry, I thought I put it there. I will go put it there now.
Sounds good.
Oh no, it's above right
Oh.
there. I did put it there. We just responded. Basically, change it from not being an extension method to being an extension method.
I mean, it seems reasonable to me. I mean, let me look at the.
It's not been exposed yet. It's in PR to expose.
No, I meant like what other APIs we have a vector of t, so I just get a sense for what's happening there. But not vector of t, right? It's the vector class. The non-generic one, of course. And so yeah, it seems some of the ones are extension. No, it seems like none of the ones we currently have are extension methods.
Right. The main difference between vector of t and vector 128 and vector 256 is vector of t exposes most of its operations as proper instance methods. When we were going to expose vector 128 and vector 256, we noticed that this actually hinders code gen optimizations due to this being reference taken. And so we opted for vector 128 and 256 to make everything a static extension method instead. That way you would still get the nice to use API, but you wouldn't have the reference the reference taken. That
what I'm
hinders
saying
code
is
gen.
the static methods on the non-generic vector class today. So we have, as vector byte, as vector double, as vector int16, as vector int32. None of them are extension methods. They're all just regular static methods.
Right, because the way you're supposed to use it with vector of t normally is to go through the explicit casting operator.
Oh, I see what you're saying. They're just the fallback for languages that don't have casting.
Right. In the case of as, it's a convenience method for users who are using purely generic code, so they don't have to write the all 10 conditionals and hinder inlining and other things themselves.
I see. So, yeah, I mean,
is the vector type already restricted to a closed generic?
It's restricted to struct, but the runtime implementation restricts it to 10 types. We are expanding that to support 2 additional types, and in the future we may also add half or other types as well.
Right, but if you right now say vector of your custom value type,
it will throw.
It will throw. So
and that
this
will always
this as is no worse than the current constructor.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have strong opinions here. I can live with this either way. So if people have strong opinions, now is your time.
Yeah, it's fine, I guess.
Then
closed generics are always weird, but this is not adding a closed generic. It's adding a exactly as closed generic to an existing closed generic.
Right. Does an extension method aid the type inference for the generic?
Not today. You have to specify both t from and t2, and that's what the user was asking about. The issue with having it be an instance method, however, is it hinders code gen. And at least with vector 128 and 256, we said that was undesirable overall because it leads users into a pit of failure with the types that are namely meant to be performance oriented.
I mean, then honestly, unless we know there's language feature work for .NET 6 that makes that better, to me, then honestly, making that an extension method doesn't do much. It just looks weird in a different way, right?
It makes it more readable overall. The typical use case for generics is you'll have the as method at most once per input and once for the output. And having it read as with the expected type and the type you're casting to ends up helping the readability of the code overall, as compared to having to call vector as type input.
Sorry, I'm just looking at this right now because I'm very bad at visualizing, apparently.
Here, I'll type it in chat.
I mean, it is a few characters shorter, but this is what it... Here. This is what it would look like, right?
Yeah.
I guess not quite.
The other one, at least to me and other people I've asked, is easier to parse and visualize.
Yeah, I mean, you have evidence, you have opinions, I don't, so I yield to you.
Yeah, I mean, As an extension method, people can still call it in static syntax. So.
Yep. And this mirrors what we did for 128 and 256. So prior art.
All right. Binder. Who marked this again? This would be Santi if he's on the call. I think he's out, so he probably isn't on the call. Can anybody else talk to this? Otherwise, let's skip it.
Miriam, do you know this one?
Sorry, was muted.
Do you know this issue at all?
Yes, I remember this one. Let me quickly have a skim through 36015. 36015.
Oh, I see. This is the configuration binder. When I hear binder, I think reflection. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to read on Santi's comment. Okay.
Oh, so this is if there's mismatches between the type and what's actually in configuration. Doesn't throw an exception if there's a binding issue.
It won't fail.
So do you know what configuration binder does, Emo?
I assume it's the thing that glues whatever thing you have in your JSON to your strongly typed option types, right?
Right. Yep. I mean, it doesn't have to just be JSON, obviously, because there's other configurations,
Right.
but yes. It's like a deserializer from configuration to an object, strongly typed object model.
Yeah, it sounds. I mean, like I think I made mistakes like the person describing here. So I guess my question will be similar to what the other thing we just reviewed is like, do we think we want to have different defaults here? Or do we think we want it to be this opt-in?
I mean, the error on missing property, yeah, I don't know, because imagine the case where you have the error on missing key is actually the one that I was thinking of. Imagine the case where you have 5 properties and in the configuration, the user only sets 4.
Right.
I mean, that means like, well, set the other one to the default value, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to make that an error seems weird that it's like then the user would have to actually put the default value into their configuration to make it. So, I mean, that one feels like we shouldn't just change it to always error.
Well, the way
So both of these would be opt-in, right? Like both of the new APIs would default to not error, which is the current behavior.
Yeah, I think the proposal here is to have the current behavior as the default, and then the new behavior would be opt-in. That's how I read it. But like,
Right.
just to ask Eric, like, it seems like what you're describing is the inverse of what's proposed here, because basically it says, if doing configuration binding, a configuration key is found for which the provided model object does not have an appropriate property. So that means you have one more in your JSON file than you actually have.
That's the first one.
Oh, I see. So
The second one, a property is found on a target object model which does not have a corresponding configuration key provided by any configuration provider.
Why would you ever want to throw for this? It seems like a...
In case you didn't have defaults and you literally wanted the person to provide you values for everything.
Yeah, I have a hard time thinking of a case where I would want that. That seems very...
Where you want to force everything to be configured explicitly? I don't think that's too crazy. I think it's weird, the alternative design, to try to combine them. I think treating missing keys or missing properties as different things is better than not doing that.
No, I'm not saying, make the same decision for both. I'm just saying, like, for the first one, it completely makes sense because you basically have a type 1 in your JSON file, right? Or you
Say there's one property called connection string.
Right.
Right? If you didn't provide a connection string, bomb out right away, right? Like that would be in my head what that scenario would be. Like, I have a small set of properties that must be provided. Like, there's no defaults for a connection string.
Right, but like I don't know, like I have no idea how you can configure this, but it seems like probably a design that I would think would make more sense is some sort of attribute on the property that says required or something.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
I mean, that seems to be the more sensible way of doing it, because the problem with the second setting is it's basically every configuration object and then every property in every configuration object. That seems a policy that seems hard to be desirable.
Just on the object being bound, because binder options, you call bind for each object, right? So like sections, if you will, in your configuration.
Oh, so they're not global options, they're literally just every time you call bind explicitly, you pass that in? Oh yeah, here's an
Right.
example, I see. Okay, then never mind.
The required is an interesting, like that actually is, like, I think, a good idea too.
Yeah, it
I don't know
seems
if it
more intuitive at least.
Right.
it
So
like-
I do think.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, I was just saying, like,
Yeah.
to me, it kind of seems that most options, I mean, they're called options for a reason, right? Because they're usually optional, right? And there's probably very few things that are actually truly required, right? And so just,
Yeah, so I
modeling
think-
those seems like a sensible design.
Yeah, for error on key missing specifically, the attribute does seem more useful, though would require a bit more design. Error on property missing, I think, is just useful.
The first one makes total sense
Yeah.
for sure. Do they have a usage scenario for the second one besides the one I just made up?
Mm.
I don't think so.
Trying to think if like something like this, like error on key missing, would be something that can be handled when we are doing options validation, like rather than having a binder option.
Yes, I mean, that's what we often do today when binding options, is we'll look at the object afterwards, and if
So
the
that's
connection
the-
string is empty or null, then
Mhm. So if that was like, if that use case was kind of properly handled, or like it was like the, I don't know, best practice or something, then arguably would we still need a binder options for, let's say, error on key missing? That's one thing I'm thinking about. And I think if I understood Emo's recommendation correctly, if we had like a attribute on the properties themselves, it wouldn't have to be like all or nothing. So like if it's the connection string, then maybe for the connection string only. Then maybe like there are cases where like the whole application may be logging, or a lot of things are not necessarily always specified, but they're like set by default, and then someone needs to go through all properties and see if they are missing anything. I'm not sure if this is just my first thought.
So can we approve error on property missing and then maybe investigate further the error on key missing and look at the attribute possibly?
I mean, in the original post, they mentioned that in this case, the binder simply defaults null to that property, and that results in later runtime null exceptions if there's a configuration issue.
If you don't check, yeah, for sure.
Right. So, I mean, it doesn't seem unreasonable to have that behavior.
So this is, that one's, you have a word in config that it can't figure out what thing to match it to in code?
No,
That's the error on property missing.
it's that you have a property in your code in the object that didn't get supplied by. So the other thing is this goes through objects, right? Like, this isn't just simple strings and you're checking a string for null. It's like, I have my top level section, that section has a subsection, right? You'd have to check for null all the way down all the time. Where here, if you could just say error on key missing, if that section isn't provided, then you you get a pretty explicit error message right away on startup that says, hey, I'm trying to bind, my nested section, and there's no value for that. So it does seem reasonable, the second option as well.
So you're saying they're orthogonal, as in like we can decide to provide an attribute, we can decide not to provide an attribute, but we should also expose it as a setting.
Okay, so the one that we're talking about approving, error on property missing, that's you said something in config and I don't know what that is in code.
Right, I think that's the least controversial one. And I'm not saying that error on key missing is worthless. It's just that it seems a little less.
And what are we doing
necessary
with defaults on that one? Is it defaulting to error or defaulting to ignore?
Yeah.
It's defaulting to the current behavior.
Fair enough. Whatever
that's
that means.
The proposal. I think honestly for the first one, I don't think it would be terrible to default to throw, but it would be, of course, the breaking change. Right?
Well,
that's
I was going to argue with that. It's like OpenSSL had this model in their configuration, and then they added some properties in OpenSSL 1.1. And when .NET Core picked up OpenSSL 1.0, and then it found a config file that specified those properties, then the process terminated. Because it was, you've configured me with something I don't understand. And then, so later, when they added stuff in 1.1, they then changed their model to, if I don't know what it is, ignore it. Because this could be config from the future running on an old app. So
yeah, I
throwing
agree.
needs to be something, throwing to me feels like something you should opt into unless we're already doing it, in which case it's fine. But
I see. Okay, so
if you write your application perfectly the first time and you never change your config model, throwing makes sense. But if you ever evolve it, then it doesn't make sense. That's my feedback.
So for the second scenario, we're saying that part needs work. Go back to see if we can use data annotation attributes like required. I
mean, that would be, at least that's my intuition, right? I'm not feeling super strongly. I just feel like if you only support this property for the entire object, that seems like a fairly wide net that I don't think works for every case.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. It feels more item by item.
And if you want literally the whole thing, you put required on every property.
Or could you just put it on the type? Like, could you have an attribute on the type? Like, if you're going to go the attribute routes for key missing.
Yes. I mean, it would be a bit weird to say required on the type, but I guess you could.
Well, it might be a different attribute.
Yeah, I mean, if somebody has a scenario for absolutely requiring everything and that really comes out, then you could come back and still propose it. It feels, it sounded weird to me.
Yeah, it seems like it's mostly proposed because it's kind of like the two cases, right? And so it seems like just orthogonal to propose both of them, right? But I'm just saying, in practice, the second one seems odd to me.
In the original post, like the second one is the one that they're talking about. In the event the property doesn't get bound, the binder simply defaults to null for that property. This results in runtime null exceptions. And now your app, gets null refs.
From the binder or from the thing that walked through the dot without checking if it was null?
Obviously from the thing that walked through the dot.
Right. So that seems like they wanted it on this particular item, which is, I didn't understand that I should supply a default value. And then really that's a bug in their application of they had a config model and they didn't accept do whatever you want as the config.
Yeah, to be clear, does the binder set it explicitly to null, or does it mean the binder doesn't touch it, and so whatever the constructor for the type did is still honored? Because if the binder sets it explicitly to null, I mean, yeah, then the developer can't really provide a default, right? That seems like almost like a conceptual bug on the side of the binder.
I don't know. I would assume it just leaves the property set, but if somebody doesn't initialize the property in their object, right? If they just have a
Right.
simple class or like a record or whatever.
Right. I mean, to me, again, that feels intuitive because that's how, that's how you would, I think, expect the serializer to work, right? You wouldn't expect the serializer to magically set things to null unless the user explicitly set it in JSON to null, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I guess the only risk is if we don't do the error on key missing, is there a risk that in like .NET 6 we don't cover the scenario at all because we don't do like the attributes either? And like worst case, it's a little bit redundant. There are workarounds, of course. You can always check properties explicitly in your consuming code.
I think I think it's on track to do a little more improvement for options validation for 6.0. So maybe that would overlap with error on key missing. So that's my thought.
Yeah.
Does error on property missing also overlap with that?
Error on property missing. I'm trying to think. Yeah, I'm not too sure if like maybe we can kind of. I'm not super keen on having these APIs in yet, but like my only argument would be that maybe this is like a one-off thing as opposed to maybe it's a one-off feature that we're just going to put in on configurations, and I'm not sure how much value there would be. And there's I don't know what you guys think, but
I mean, are we doing more work in this area that would potentially change this setting?
Sorry?
With the options validation that you just mentioned,
Yeah.
work,
Yep.
would doing that work potentially change this setting, this error on property missing?
My thought is that maybe if that is done, the eager validation is done, then maybe there would be no need for someone to have like a binding option for error on key missing. But maybe I'll post a comment on this and like see if anyone opposes that. I'll link the options validation issue as well.
Regardless of what we choose on error on key missing, I would like to get error on property missing approved because it seems like that's hard to work around, right?
What I was saying is if we're doing some whole options validation framework feature, and that would affect this API, right? If we would have a different way of doing it with the rest of this feature that we're talking about.
So I don't know anything about options validation. We don't have to get too deep into it, but does that deal with the I configuration binding to options, or is that after the options have already been like created?
It's upon startup. So from what I've understood is when we're using service provider in DI, there is a service provider option for doing validate on build, but that's because DI is not hooked up with options. The thing about options validation is that if we could have that sort of functionality, but not for like early when we build to be able to do validation on options. So I think it has relevancy with binding. If we need to do binding to be able to do the validate eager feature properly. But that's my high-level thought about this without going too deep in the code yet. Correct me if I'm wrong, though.
Yeah, I mean, even if we have a customizable configuration or like configuration validation, I don't know. I think the property still adds value because if you validate something, you probably still don't deal with unmatched properties by default, right? You would just say, well, the user specified value X is value X in range or something like that, or the user specified these 4 values, is the combination legal or something, right? So I mean, to me, this property really is like, it's not a well-formed configuration file because we can't bind the value, right? That is usually not something that I would think if user would actually write validation for. You would expect that to be already done by the framework. So that's why I don't think I think approving this seems unproblematic to me.
Yeah, I think it's good to approve as is. The only reason that I would not do it is if there was a plan in this framework to add a drain collection like the JSON serializer has of, hey, someone gave me a thing and I didn't know what to do with it, so I shoved it in this dictionary.
Oh, I see.
But if that's not already being planned, then I would just add this property, and even if it gets added in the future, then it turns out just leave this property set to false.
Right.
So
my only question is on the
I think it's
name.
fine.
Do we like the name? Because to me, error on property missing is like, the way I think about this is just somebody didn't specify the property in the JSON file, but it really means error on, unmatched property or unknown property or something like that, right?
Yeah, I think I'd prefer a unmatched or unknown instead of missing.
Anybody else opinions?
I agree that it should be changed. Unmatched or unknown sounds good.
Let's go with
Yep.
unknown then.
So error on unknown property.
Or maybe ever on.
But it's not unknown property, it's unknown like setting, right?
What about I guess, yeah. Yeah, I mean,
Right, because unknown property would be the other one.
True.
Error on unmatched configuration. I don't know.
what about unbound configuration?
That sounds good. There was something in config and you couldn't figure out where to bind it.
The reason I don't like key is, to me, it's like you kind of have to think like, oh, this is a JSON terminology, which I don't think people actually think.
It's not even that. It's like configuration terminology. So it's like even worse.
Fair enough.
We're in the configuration namespace, right? The configuration is, there's keys and values.
Mhm.
I mean, we are, but I don't expect everyone writing this like bind code to be like in the configuration namespace mindset all the time. Like,
All right. So then here is my thing then. Okay.
Looks good to me.
All right. Then let me approve this.
What are we doing with the other part that we didn't approve? Are we opening a new issue for it?
I mean, one thing we could do is you can either just, flip it back to API ready for review and then add the other thing to it, or we can just separate issue. Like, it's up to you. Like, to me, the nuance here is, if we think we want to do both or neither, I would probably just put it back to API needs work. But if we believe that, we can just ship half of it, then I would just approve the half and then say, well, if you feel otherwise, then tell us, or file a secondary issue.
I mean, the other one doesn't actually need API changes, right? The other one is just start respecting the required attribute.
Right. I mean, that's one way of doing it, right? I mean, it kind of depends on what the intended design is, right? If the original issue opener feels like, no, I want this to be a property because reasons, then that's a different thing. Then, but yeah, I agree with you. Like, I mean, I think we generally believe we can ship just this one public API and then change behavior on the other side, right? All right. So then, yeah. Anything more to this?
can we call it? Yeah. What about error on unknown configuration? I know it's kind of a smaller thing, but unbound. Like, couldn't that imply that like there's something in your options object that just didn't get bound because there was no config for it?
Fair enough.
The trouble is, all the words are going to make sense from both directions. It's do you think of it as coming from the file or coming from the object graph?
Maybe you should just say
'cause
unknown then.
config is
Like, because unknown kind of implies there is something that I don't know what to do with, right? Versus anything you specify in your object is not unknown, right?
Yeah.
I just went with unbound because it's kind of like the inverse to the binder, but yeah, I agree with Stephen Shorey that it's ambiguous again for the same reasons.
Yep.
All right. So then
Push approved. Move on.
we just did. All right. So is this a fast one?
Yeah, this one, yeah.
What's the actual API proposal? Oh, here.
It's very straightforward.
So basically just allow to pass in the builder?
Because iHost builder, so the builder, the way it's already implemented is instantiated within, but then adding the extension method, adding the new overload create default builder would allow us to kind of pass it in. And if you scroll up, I think there David has a reason behind where this is needed. Is that true?
He's got his own Feather HTTP framework, and he wants to set some things on the builder and then call the default configure. He already has a builder that he wants to do something with.
I see. So it's basically a copy constructor. It's basically like, you know, I have a builder, initialize all the settings from that builder and let me tweak it further, right? Is that
Well,
logic?
yeah, I mean, somebody already created a builder. So it's weird because like calling this create default builder is kind of wrong because I already have the builder. And I just want to set all the default settings that you would in create default builder onto this already instantiated
So
builder.
it still gives you back the same instance of iHost builder, but it basically applied the defaults to it?
Right.
That is confusing.
Can we call it configure default builder?
Yeah.
That's what the internal method's called, right? Or configure builder.
Apply builder defaults.
Yeah, I mean, to me, create, like, I really read this as a copy constructor. That was that's the way I understood the API. But like, if it's actually just initializing some defaults, that's, I mean, if you call an API that does create and it doesn't actually create anything, that's a bit weird.
I agree.
Oh, great! This class literally only has these two members today. Okay, then.
But that's okay. There's host create default builder, and then host configure defaults that takes a builder and an args.
Yeah, that seems fine to me.
Configure defaults, is that what you said?
That was my guess at what I would maybe name this name right away.
Sounds reasonable.
Yeah, and then I would be void returning. But if everything in here is...
People want to change.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
They love fluent APIs around this world.
All right, so then this would be this. You okay with that? Oh, great.
Presumably configure defaults.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, and then now I don't have to argue that the parameter should be in the order.
Cool. All good?
Looks good to me.
All right, then approved.
All right. And that's time.
Cool. So nice. So today we went through 6 issues. That's actually decent. All right. So then I see you, I think, next Tuesday. So I think this was the last extra one that we had, or maybe we have one more. I will probably set up more because I really want to get to a point where we have less than 10 again, so that we don't have this ever-growing backlog situation.
We have an extra one next Thursday.
Yeah.
So
Hopefully that's
Tuesday,
enough.
Thursday next week. Yeah.
And hopefully there's no more incoming, right? So we can also assess next week what's happening. But if next Thursday we're again back to 30, then we need extra. Otherwise we don't handle the incoming.
May I just ask, why didn't we have it as configure default builder rather than configure defaults?
Either one works for me.
Because the builder is not the default. It's not a default builder. It's some other builder. We're just applying the defaults that the host would have done if it built the builder.
Sure. Okay.
I mean, any reason we wouldn't make this an extension method on the builder? Seems a bit more logical from a flow standpoint. I hear nothing, so that means people disagree with me.
I mean, like I think it's fine, especially if you're going for it returns the first argument as a fluent binding, that because then it's a flow call instead of a static call. So that seems fine.
Yeah, I like it as an extension method.
Then let's do that. Seems a bit more logical.
There's a host builder extensions class that already has a bunch of extension methods on iHost builder. So it seems like that would be the most appropriate place.
Sorry.
Maybe, but if this is calling from a static thing from host that would get some defaults, it may need to go back into host to get those values. I don't know where it's getting them from, but
yeah, I mean, underneath the covers, it's probably calling an internal method on that host class.
I guess if they're in the same assembly, they can go wherever.
Yeah, they're in the same assembly. It's just there's the host class, which only has those two create, and then all the iHost builder extension methods are in this other class.
What
so
is
it kind
called? Is it called host extensions? No.
It's called hosting host builder extensions.
All right.
Don't you
Well, as
love
long
that?
as emo doesn't cave on configure going back to create, then I'm good with whatever. And so I'm going to go ahead and drop.
That seems reasonable. So it's the same namespace, it's just a different type, right?
Yeah, just because that's where all the rest of the, so then whack off the existing.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, and I like that it doesn't noise up host dot this way.
Yeah.
True.
Nice. All right, then let's call it a day. And then I see everybody next week. Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Bye.
See ya.